I bought a 1967 Saab 96 with a two-stroke engine. That's all you need to know, right? Okay, I'm gonna get in and I'm gonna drive it more because I like it. I've had in the past two Saab 96s, both blue and both from 1969. One of them was a parts car, so it doesn't really count, but I did technically have two of them. Both of those cars had the V4 engine from Ford. Now, it's a fine engine, but at one point, I got the opportunity to drive a slightly earlier Saab with the two-stroke engine, and from that point on, the V4 engine was completely ruined. Like I said, the V4 is a fine engine. It's objectively better in most metrics than the two-stroke. But compared to the zingy, rev-happy, poppy two-stroke engine, the V4 is just boring. Needless to say, after experiencing a two-stroke Saab, I desperately wanted a two-stroke Saab. The problem was, at the time, I couldn't afford a two-stroke Saab. I tried to make the V4 in my existing Saab more interesting by upgrading it to a two-barrel carburetor, but A, I did a terrible job, and B, it just wasn't the same. Eventually I got tired of messing with it and got bored with it, so I decided to sell it. It had nothing to do with all the rust I discovered inside it. And naturally, when I sold that Saab, I immediately replaced it with a two-stroke Saab. In my dreams. I couldn't afford one, we've been over this. Earlier this year, I suddenly realized, I can afford one now. So I got one, and here it is, in red. And not only does it have the two-stroke engine, it has the higher output, better sounding, triple carburetor, oil injected, high compression, Monte Carlo spec engine. So is it everything I ever dreamed of? Wait, that wasn't the cue for a transition, stop! If you're unfamiliar with the origin story of Saab, Saab was, and still is, a Swedish airplane company. In fact, the name Saab was originally an acronym that stood for Svenska Aeroplan Aktiebolaget, which is Swedish for Swedish Airplane Company. Not especially creative, but it does get the point across. And one day, someone at Saab must have said, "You hörde det, vi borde bygga en bil. En bil!" And so they built a car. Saab's first model was the 92, a car clearly built by a company who had never built cars before. And by the looks of it, had never seen one either. Production of the 92 began in late 1949, and it was only available in green at the beginning. It was front-wheel drive with a transverse-mounted two-cylinder, two-stroke water-cooled engine derived from a DKW design from Germany. It had a 3-speed transmission with freewheel to prevent oil starvation. It had torsion bar suspension, suicide doors, thermosiphon cooling, and looks that would make a frog blush. And it won't surprise you to learn, coming from an airplane company, the 92 was rather aerodynamic as well, having the same coefficient of drag as a modern Rivian R1T of just 0.3. In 1955, the 92 was replaced with the 93. Gone was the 92's transverse-mounted two-cylinder, two-stroke engine, and in its place was a new, more powerful 750cc three-cylinder two-stroke engine. In 1957, the 93B was released, with some changes. And in 1959, the 93F was released, with some more changes, including ditching the rear hinge doors for regular front hinge doors. Boring. The 93 was also the first Saab to be sold in the US. That's where I am. Can you imagine the sort of person in the US in the late 50s that would buy one of these? They'd have to look at the likes of the Chevy Bel Air with its V8 and say, no, instead, I'm gonna buy a small bubble with whiskers and a lawnmower engine made by a Swedish airplane company. It's a much better use of my money. In 1960, the 93 was replaced with the 96. If you're wondering what happened to 94 and 95, the 94 was the Saab Sonnet, and the 95 was basically the 96, but in wagon form, and came slightly earlier. The 96 looked extremely similar at the beginning to the 93 it replaced, but there were a whole host of changes, including a slightly larger 840cc engine. These early 96s were referred to as the bullnose and had the radiator set behind the engine. Now, I don't know if this was a standard feature, but the bullnose Saabs that I've seen had a little roll-down curtain just behind the grille to block off the engine bay to cope with those brutal Swedish winters. How adorable. In 1965, they restyled the 96 to what is now referred to as the long nose because the nose is longer and the radiator moved from behind the engine to in front of the engine behind the grille like a normal car. The long nose Saabs also dropped the simple front hinge hood design for this wacky arrangement. I don't know what you call this style of hood, but this is how it opens. The 96 was restyled again in 1969, with the US getting its own version with unique headlights because of our stupid fixation with sealed beams that went on for far too long. And that was the last major update until it ended production in 1980, although they stopped selling it in the US in the mid-70s for whatever reason. This video is brought to you by Factor. Ready-to-heat meals delivered straight to your door in a chilled box. They come straight to your door in a chilled box. I already said that. All you have to do to pick your meal is to pick your meal. That doesn't make sense. In my case, black pepper and sage pork chop. And then to slide off the cardboard cover, stab the film twice to vent it, pop it in the microwave for 2 minutes, and your Factor meal is delicious and ready to eat. It's done! All right, I'll slow down now. Factor meals are delicious. So much easier than going to a grocery store and so much better than takeout. This is a pork chop on Brussels sprouts with a side of broccoli and some delightful seasonings and sauces and stuff. I wouldn't make this myself. I'm too lazy, and I have it here in 2 minutes. And also, it's insane the quality they're able to get out of a microwave. If you want to try Factor for yourself, go to factor75.com and use code AgingWheel50 at checkout for 50% off your first box and 20% off your next month of boxes. Again, that's factor75.com and use code AgingWheel50 at checkout for 50% off your first box and 20% off your next month of boxes. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video and giving me delightful pork chop to eat. There are a variety of two-stroke engine variants available in the 96 over time. There was triple carb, single carb, high compression, low compression, with or without oil injection, with power ranging from roughly 38 horsepower to about 55 horsepower. In 1967, Saab added a 1.5-liter four-stroke V4 from Ford as an engine option to the 96. It made 65 horsepower, had actual torque, and didn't burn oil by design. This engine was introduced in 1967. By 1968, it became by far the best-selling engine option for the 96, and in 1969, the V4 became the only engine option. The two-stroke was dropped entirely. Like I said, the V4 is objectively a better engine, and it's not at all hard to understand why it almost immediately killed off the two-stroke. But I don't want things like good and torque. I want silly two-stroke noises. My Saab is from 1967. Like I said, there are a variety of different two-stroke variants over the years for the 96, and I'm not entirely sure which variants were available in what years and what regions, and I don't know what originally came in this car, but it doesn't really matter because that's not what's in it anymore. The previous owner of this, at some point, pulled the engine out of this car and sent it off to Saab specialist Tom Donnie to be rebuilt and modified. Tom built up this engine to the Monte Carlo spec, sort of. This engine was built up with many go-fast modifications. It's been ported and milled. It has triple carburetors, oil injection, a hybrid crankshaft. I don't know what that means either. I don't know what sort of power this engine made originally, but now it's got to be pushing, well, at least 60. Yeah, this engine makes a lot more decibels than horsepower. That's not the only non-standard thing about this car. You probably noticed the engine bay is a different color from the rest of the car. Yeah, this has been repainted at some point, and it wasn't the best paint job ever, but I don't care. I bought this for the engine. Paint job's good enough for me. Also non-standard are the seats. The front seats have been replaced, if I remember correctly, with seats from a later Saab 99. They look right in the car, but they sit up a fair bit higher than stock 96 seats. In fact, my eye line is directly in line with the top of the windshield, which is annoying. And if I remember correctly, the rear seat is stock, but it's been reupholstered to match the front seats. And the original non-retractable seatbelts were replaced with these retractable inertial reel seatbelts, for added convenience more than safety. The steering wheel is also not original to the car. It's a Saab steering wheel, but not for this Saab. And these utterly wonderful soccer ball wheels are also not original to this car. They are Saab wheels, but this didn't come with them originally. Little side note, the old Saab logo with the airplane is my favorite car logo of all time. Now, it's not the best car logo of all time. That honor obviously belongs to the Alfa Romeo badge, because how do you beat a car badge with a snake eating a dude on it? You can't. Oh, and just in case you forgot, Saab started out as an airplane company. Airplane, 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 airplane! And just in case that wasn't enough airplane for you, fuselage, wing, propeller swerve, wingtip. The front of this car is designed to look like an airplane. Or at least someone told me that. I don't actually know that's true. But it looks, there's a wing in the, woo. How about a quick tour? Trunk, spare tire, door, front seats, back seats. Fantastic camera work. Gauges. This one isn't stock, By the way, this is how you can tell it wasn't originally a Sport or Deluxe model, because if it was, it would have had a speedometer and a tachometer, both equal sized. And that concludes the tour. Now this is a Saab. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't at least briefly go over some of the oddities of this vehicle. You know, aside from the two-stroke engine, which is a weird choice for a car. The windows don't roll straight down like you'd expect. They pivot from the front. Because of its front-wheel drivedness, the floor is completely flat. But you also have these huge wheel wells intruding into the cabin space, which pushes the pedals off to the side. So the pedals are offset to the center of the car, despite what the imprints on the floor mat may suggest. The radio, no, sadly it does not work, is in the glove box. These aren't just sun visors, they're Saab safety sun visors. Also in Swedish. The hood, I already showed you how it opens, but the edge of it isn't designed to line up with anything. So it always looks like it isn't fully closed. But probably the best quirk of them all, oh, I said the off-limits word. The best oddity of them all is the transmission. It's a 4-speed column-shifted manual transmission, which is a little bit weird, but this transmission also has freewheel. What's freewheel? With a 4-stroke engine, the crankcase is where all the oil is. The oil is pressurized and continually circulated around the engine. And the fuel-air mixture enters the combustion chamber through valves usually situated on top of the combustion chamber. In a 2-stroke like the Saab's engine, there is no oil contained and circulated around the engine because the carburetor feeds the fuel-air mixture into the crankcase, where it then enters the combustion chamber through ports on the cylinder wall. This is an exhaust port, by the way. Because the crankshaft and connecting rods are coated in this fuel-air mixture, the way a 2-stroke engine like this is lubricated is by adding oil to that fuel-air mixture, usually by pre-mixing oil into the gas tank. This works well enough, but it creates a problem. If the engine's lubrication comes from application of the throttle, no throttle means no lubrication. So in scenarios like coasting down a long hill with the engine at high revs off throttle, you could oil starve the engine. That's what the freewheel prevents. The freewheel is a one-way bearing, in this case on the input shaft of the transmission. So the engine can drive the transmission and therefore the wheels, but the transmission cannot backdrive the engine. So in scenarios where you're coasting down a long hill, rather than the engine being held at high RPMs with no throttle, potentially oil starving it, the engine's allowed to drop down to idle where it can stay happy and lubricated. And yes, this absolutely alters the driving experience. I'm in 4th gear now. If I let off the throttle, engine's idling down, but I'm still coasting ahead. And there's some positives to the freewheel device as well. For example, clutchless shifting. I can, without using the clutch, shift down to 3rd and then back up to 4th. No clutch needed. And obviously another positive is that it prevents the engine from being oil starved. But with this engine, I don't even need it, but we'll get back to that later. But there's also a negative to freewheeling as well. Zero engine braking. I left the throttle, there's nothing slowing me down. Now, it's not like this 850cc ball bearing engine would provide much slowing force, but it would provide more slowing force than zero, which is what it's doing now. So yeah, the freewheel makes for a rather unique driving experience. But the best part about the freewheel in the Saab's transmission is this little lever down here right above the pedals. Pull this out, and now the freewheeling is locked up, so you have effectively a regular transmission with engine braking and all the rest of it. The ability to lock up the freewheel also gives you the ability to push start the car if the battery dies, which you can't do if it's freewheeling. But engines with an oil injector, like this one, don't even really need the freewheel because the lubrication isn't coming from oil that's pre-mixed into the gas tank. It's coming from a mechanically driven oil pump mounted to the side of the engine, fed by a separate oil tank. And that oil pump is tied to engine speed, not throttle, so freewheeling isn't even really necessary on oil-injected cars like this one. That said, I still keep freewheel engaged on this for that full Saab experience. And even though it's not strictly necessary to have freewheeling on an oil-injected engine like this one, it's still nicer on the engine if it's not being dragged along at high speeds with no throttle. Also, following Tom Donnie's recommendation, I do lightly pre-mix this. According to him, the oil injector is just a little bit on the light side, so I add about 100-to-1 ratio in the gas to help the engine last longer, be nicer to it. The later V4 Saabs also definitely didn't need freewheeling. I mean, all the oil was contained within, coasting is no problem, but they still had freewheeling devices because they used the same transmission from the earlier 2-stroke Saabs. Well, I should say they theoretically had freewheeling. The V4 produced a lot more torque than the 2-stroke engine that came before it. a little too much for those freewheeling devices to handle, so most of them just jammed up. Both of my previous 296s with the V4 engine had jammed freewheeling devices, so they were essentially just normal transmissions. Is it time to talk about the driving experience yet? Yeah, I think it's time to talk about the driving experience. I bought this car mainly for the engine, so what's it like? When I took this for its first drive after getting it licensed, my main thought was, is there something wrong with this? And after a bit more driving, it didn't get better. In fact, a few situations arose that felt like things that shouldn't happen. So I reached out to Tom Donnie, who built this engine, and asked him, is it supposed to be like this? And he said, yes. So what am I talking about? It's completely gutless. And I mean no torque at all below about 4,000 RPM. This right here is a very slight uphill grade. I'm gonna shift into third, where we'll be at 2,500 RPM, and I'm gonna floor it. 3,000, 3,500, 4,000, 45, 5, and now it's time to shift because red line's at 5,000 RPM. It is gutless below 4,000. And hill starts? Forget about it. There's 2 intersections now me that are now completely off limits because I tried to do a hill start there, and there's only 2 ways in this car to do a hill start if the hill's big enough. Do a big smoky burnout or a big nasty clutch slip. Furthermore, it needs more gears. The gap between third and fourth is enormous. Third gear tops out at just below 50 miles an hour, and then I shift into fourth, it's all the way down to 3,000 RPM. Foot to the floor, I am losing speed up this hill going 50 miles an hour. The worst speed range for this thing is between 50 and 60 miles per hour. That is too fast for third gear, but not in the power band for fourth gear. It can't maintain speed up a hill in between 50 and 60 miles an hour, and it's really annoying. Now, of course, the benefit of the height of fourth gear is that it'll happily do 70 miles an hour, but I just wish there was something in between third and fourth. And traffic in this thing is just irritating. This engine likes to be either full throttle or completely idling. No in between, which, as you may realize, is not how traffic works. And there's a very specific set of speed ranges it likes to go, which I'm not currently doing. And that doesn't often coincide with the flow of the traffic. Honestly, I was pretty disappointed at first. All those years of wanting this car with this engine, only to find out it's as gutless as insert politician name here. That's why I reached out to Tom. I thought, this can't be right. But to quote Tom, there is no, and he wrote no in all caps, low in torque on any of them. Which he followed up with the best advice I've ever heard. Drive it like you stole it. That's some doctor's orders I can get behind. So that's the only way I drive this now. By wringing the absolute potatoes out of it. The only proper way to drive a 2-stroke Saab is to drive it like you absolutely hate it. And once I verified that there is indeed nothing wrong with it and slightly modified my driving habits, I absolutely love this thing. It's by no means fast, but actually, you know what? Let's test it. Let's see how not fast it is. I am so sorry, clutch. That wasn't very good. Yep, see, fourth is too tall. 16 seconds. I've also just discovered that my speedometer is way off. Way off. 16.88 seconds. That's honestly a lot faster than I was expecting. I expected a time in the 20s. But then again, apparently the speedometer's been lying to me this whole time. It's reading low. By a lot, regardless of expectation. Verified by the numbers, it's very much not fast. But the freewheel, combined with the peaky torque curve, combined with all the noise it makes this so much fun. It's such a unique driving experience. And I mean unique in a good way, not like, oh, that's unique. Again, it's not at all hard to see why the V4 killed off this 2-stroke engine almost immediately. I mean, can you imagine living with this on a daily basis? There's a motorcycle trapped in the engine bay. I am so glad I bought this. Which, by the way, I haven't told you yet how much I paid for this wonderful screaming monster. $12,000, which I think is a screaming deal, quite literally. Thanks for watching. Here's more screaming Saab noises.